In 1789, George Washington, the President of the United States of America, visited the town of Fairfield, Connecticut, and changed not only the town, but the entire state as well. The reason George Washington came to Fairfield was to assess the damages that were brought on by the burning of Fairfield 10 years prior in 1779. The year is 1779, and the Revolutionary War is raging on. William Tyrrell, a British general, was sent to the towns along the Long Island Sound on Connecticut that supported the Revolution. He sent almost 2,000 British soldiers to the town of Fairfield and the neighboring towns. The forces arrived by boats that landed on Campo Beach, which is now located in Westport. On July 7th, the British forces were eventually met by the Fairfield militia, and they had a violent encounter that lasted the majority of the day. The militia fought valiantly, but William Tyrrell's forces ultimately won the battle. After the fight, the British burned the entire town with ease because all of the buildings were made out of wood, leaving only a few remaining remnants of the once proud town. Before the burning of Fairfield, the town was one of, if not the most productive trade destinations in this region. Fairfield had it all, from a lucrative port to a very stable farming system and community. And because of this, they became the epicenter of trade in southern Connecticut. Southport Harbor, which is on the Long Island Sound, brought in a lot of imports from its neighbor New York, but also had a lot of exports that came out of the town, such as corn, rye, wheat, and potatoes. But unfortunately, when the town was burned, it lost all of the hard work that had been done since 1666. For the next 10 years, Fairfield struggled to rebuild to the strength that it once was. The main town was burnt to a crisp, and even 10 years later, the damaged structures were yet to be rebuilt. During those 10 years, George Washington was an extremely busy man. Most importantly, George Washington won the Revolutionary War in 1783 and signed the Treaty of Paris, which finally recognized America as an independent nation and made sure that the British would stop encroaching on American freedoms. After a very brief retirement, George Washington attended the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787 with several other prominent players in American history. At this convention, our founding fathers debated on the future of this country and what it would look like. They argued over topics such as the Constitution and how this country would run. They didn't agree on a lot of stuff, but they agreed on one thing from the start, and that was they wanted George Washington to be the country's first president. As president, George Washington took a 3-year tour of his country to learn as much as he could about the country and the citizens that lived in it. During his tours, he would immerse himself in the culture to get a feel for the post-Revolutionary War America. His first tour was to New England in 1789. After that, he traveled to Long Island in 1790, and his last tour was to the southern states in 1791. This microhistory will focus on his trip to New England, but more particularly on his visit to Fairfield, Connecticut, and the effects that it had on the state. Over the course of George Washington's life, he visited Connecticut 6 separate times, but this will only cover the visit in 1789. On October 17th, President Washington. Over the course of George Washington's life, he visited Connecticut 6 separate times, but this will only cover the visit in 1789. On October 17th, President Washington came to Fairfield to see the war damages. This was after he visited Norwalk. Unlike his visit to New Haven, George Washington was not greeted with a parade with a couple hundred people. Instead, it is believed that Washington arrived in Fairfield. The Sun Tavern, which is an inn and bar that housed the travelers that stopped by Fairfield. It is a 2-story wooden building located on the town green of Fairfield. It was burned down by the British in 1779, but Samuel Penfield rebuilt it and maintained it for the remainder of his life. Unfortunately, there is no absolute confirmation that George Washington truly stayed at the Sun Tavern. But according to Walter D. Mattis, Fairfield's town historian, he has strong beliefs that he did because Washington's vice president, John Adams, wrote in his journal that he slept at the inn. Mr. Mattis said, "If it was good enough for Adams, chances are it was good enough for Washington." Mr. Mattis said that he believes that the president and his entourage rolled into Fairfield close to 9 p.m. after following a road that Washington writes about in his journal and says that the road is well constructed and took him past 2 churches, one Episcopal and one that is Presbyterian. So it could be assumed that this road took them through modern-day Greenfield Hill and near the Mill Plain area. They then arrived at the Sun Tavern. They were most likely served dinner before they went upstairs to bed. Washington wrote in his journal that they got up and left after sunrise, so Mr. Mattis says that he assumes this was around 7 a.m. Before leaving, George Washington took a tour of the town. It is believed that he traveled to see Sasko Beach and walked a little on Penfield and Jennings Beach before getting back in his carriage and heading 10 miles to Stratford. On his way out of the town is when George Washington made the observation that would change Fairfield and the state forever. When he arrived in Stratford on October 18th, 1776, he wrote in the journal in which he wrote everything down and said, "The destructive evidence of British cruelty are yet visible both in Norwalk and Fairfield, as there are the chimneys of many burnt houses standing in them yet." The quote might seem short, but if you really look into it, it has a lot of deeper meanings. The quote is saying that due to the destruction that Washington saw, he was not impressed with how Fairfield recovered after the burning. He most likely knew about the lucrative past that Fairfield had before the war, and after his visit, he must have thought that they would not be able to return to the state that they once were in. By seeing the wreckage of the burned houses, he decided that this particular town's heyday was over, that there were other places that he thought deserved to be the new epicenter of trade for southern Connecticut. For the meantime, these places were probably Stamford, Stratford, or New Haven. But eventually, the state needed a new powerhouse, and that came in the form of the great American industrial city, Bridgeport. The town of Bridgeport started to become a city from the years 1800 to 1836. The start of the transition from a town to a city started 11 years after Washington's visit. This makes sense because the Industrial Revolution in America began in 1793, and major cities started to pop up across the United States. The Industrial Revolution was a time period in America where the market moved away from agriculture and focused more on industry and production. The Industrial Revolution was very kind to Bridgeport because it made the city an industrial powerhouse. A lot of major factories eventually moved to Bridgeport later in the state's history, such as General Electric and Remington Arms. It is good that the move of trade from Fairfield to Bridgeport happened because the port of Bridgeport is a deep water port, which would later become key due to the use of massive cargo ships came into play. Bridgeport Harbor would house hundreds of ships a day because a large part of Bridgeport's economy came from fishing and the practice of whaling. Unlike Southport Harbor, which is an extremely shallow port and wouldn't have worked well in the future if Washington hadn't taken the focus away from Fairfield. From the late 1800s to the early 1900s, Bridgeport worked so well because of the city's accessibility to the railroad, the well-structured roads, and like previously stated, the very good port. These qualities of Bridgeport attracted 75,000 people from all walks of life. The majority of these people were immigrants originating from Ireland, Germany, and Eastern Europe. They filled thousands of jobs and made Bridgeport's economy extremely robust. If Washington had said something back in 1789, there could have been a possibility that Fairfield would have been built up in a similar fashion to Bridgeport. Originally, Fairfield was a lot larger than it is today, and places like the area of Black Rock and Bridgeport and parts of modern-day Westport fell under Fairfield's domain. But in 1836, Westport became its own town and separated from Fairfield, Norwalk, and Weston. In conclusion, George Washington's visit might have been short and a quick glance at what the town had to offer, and it can easily be shrugged off as not important and too brief to leave a serious mark on our town and state's history. But I think it shows the contrary. It shows that Washington was just uninspired by the rebuilding of Fairfield and couldn't see the potential that Fairfield might have had. Overall, It worked out well for our state in the long run because Bridgeport most likely acted as a better attraction than Fairfield would have. Thanks to Bridgeport, our state was a large contributor to our nation's success, and we can thank George Washington by indirectly placing more attention there than he did to Fairfield.